We started this series in Hebrews, I think it was January or February of this year, and so we've been working through our way through it. We've kind of slowed down here in chapter 11. I love Hebrews chapter 11. If you're very familiar with the book, this is called the Hall of Faith or the Hall of Fame. It is a chapter full of just heroes of the faith, and so we've looked at several of them already. Tanner Smith, one of our pastoral residents, kind of kicked it off several weeks ago, looking at the first part of the chapter. He kind of focused in on Abraham. We've looked at Abraham's wife, Sarah. We've looked at the patriarchs last week, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph. And tonight, we come to the character of Moses. And so we're going to be in chapter 11, verse 23 through 29 together. And, I've kind of described this chapter as a museum, right? The Hall of Fame. You're walking the halls of this museum, and as you look to the left and to the right, you see these various exhibits of these characters. And that's what the author is doing. We read the descriptions of the stories, and of course, it's one chapter that really encapsulates a lot of chapters of Scripture in the Old Testament. And so we'll work our way back even tonight into Exodus a little bit and look at some of these stories about Moses. But one of the things that I've mentioned that we see in the Hall of Fame, in the Hall of Faith, is that faith is measured by your feet, not by your feelings. Faith is measured by your feet, not by your feelings. That's what James says, right? A faith without works is a dead faith. And so it's one thing to believe intellectually and even to believe maybe in your heart. It's another thing for that faith to produce action in your life. And that's what real biblical faith looks like. So each of these characters in Hebrews chapter 11 are an example to us of how to put feet to our faith. And as we enter this museum, we've been looking at each of these exhibits. And as we enter it in again tonight, we see images of reeds, making it seem like we're near a river, and we hear the sound of rushing water, and we see down the hall, on the wall, peeking through the tall, wild reeds, a young girl's face peeking through. She's looking through the reeds into the river, and there floating on the water is a basket, and inside of the basket sleeps God's people's hope for freedom. And you and I know that this one that sleeps in the basket is a baby who would grow to be a man named Moses. And when you hear the name Moses, if you're like me, your mind immediately goes to the great Exodus, right? The plagues, the Red Sea. But the story of Moses really starts long before you ever get to the Exodus. And as we look tonight at what faith produces, I want to just keep in mind that definition from the very beginning of this chapter in verse 1. You can look at it with me if you're there in chapter 11 in your Bible. It says, now faith, this is the definition the author of Hebrews gives us. Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. The assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. So, as we look at Moses tonight in chapter 11 and then kind of go back and remember the story in Exodus, we're going to see 4 acts in this text that are produced by faith. That is, by the assurance of something hoped for, namely, God's promise to be all that the believer needs. So we're going to watch for that in these 4 acts tonight. We're going to watch for the way hope in God produces a new kind of behavior. And we're going to notice, too, that these 4 acts of faith cover a period of 80 years from Moses' birth to the time he led God's people out of Egypt. And then finally, we're going to notice as we read that in these 4 moments of Moses' life, the stress, the circumstances, the trials, the tribulations are tremendous. Each of these acts, each of these situations is a life and death situation. that would cause any of us to be knotted up inside and barely able to sleep at night. I think sometimes it's really easy for us to kind of like separate ourselves from the stories in the Bible, and especially when we have great familiarity with them. We just kind of read over them and we don't think about, man, this was in the crucible. Moses' life and specifically the situations we're going to look at tonight here in chapter 11 are stressful situations. They're life and death situations. And so we're going to watch what faith produces in the middle of these types of situations. So Hebrews chapter 11, verse 23 through 29, we're going to see 4 different spots in the text. And I'm going to call these the 3 crises of faith in Moses' life. So we'll look at 3 crises out of these 4 situations. So look at verse 23. Let's read it together. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw that the child was beautiful and they were not afraid of the king's edict. Verse 24, by faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. By faith, he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. By faith, he kept the Passover and sprinkled the blood so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch them. Verse 29, by faith, the people crossed the Red Sea as on dry land, but the Egyptians, when they attempted to do the same, were drowned. There are 3 crisis points here in Moses' life, and the point of these verses is that faith, the assurance of things hoped for, makes all the difference at these points in our lives. Faith in God, and specifically that faith being defined as the assurance of things hoped for. So we're putting our faith in God and what he has promised in his word. Those are the things that make the difference when we have these kinds of crisis points in our own lives. And so let's look at them and let's ask God to teach us how to walk through crises by faith. The first crisis in Moses' life is here in verse 23. It says, by faith, when he was born, he was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw that the child was beautiful. And I want you to notice, it says, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. It's interesting that, excuse me, as we're introduced to Moses here in chapter 11 in the hall, it really actually begins before he was even born. And his testimony of faith really is a testimony of the faith of his family. That's how Moses' life begins, specifically the faith of his parents. And I think it's a great reminder for us. We kind of looked at this last week, right, with the patriarchs, with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph, and how they passed the promise of God down. They passed this faith in God's promises from generation to generation, and that was actually the command that God had given them in Deuteronomy chapter 6, that they were to put these things everywhere, on their doorpost, on their wrists, on the front, in front of their face, on their forehead, like the promises of God to love the Lord their God with all their heart, their soul, their strength, and mind. That was to be passed down to their children and to their children's children. And so we see this idea all the way at the very beginning as God begins to interact with his people, this idea of passing our faith on. And we see it again here with Moses. It's a great reminder for us moms and dads and grandmas and grandpas. Our faith does have an impact on our family and on future generations. Now, that doesn't mean that just because we teach it to our children, they're going to automatically believe and have faith and walk with Jesus all of their days. But it does mean that it does have an impact. And so our walk with the Lord and the way that we invest it to the next generation absolutely does have an impact. And I don't think there's a greater picture than this right here with Moses. So verse 23, who's it really talking about? Well, it's not really talking about Moses. The first has to do with the faith of his parents when he was born. And you'll remember in the story in Exodus, you can write this down. We won't turn there yet, but in Exodus chapter 1, verse 22, this is where the story begins. The king of Egypt was a very fearful man, a paranoid man, and he was paranoid that the number of specifically Jewish males, right, they're in slavery in Egypt at this point in time, they are growing greatly in population. So actually God's promise to Abraham is being fulfilled. They're multiplying. They're becoming a great nation, even though they're in bondage and slavery to the king, the Pharaoh of Egypt. And so we find out in Exodus chapter 1, verse 22, it says that the Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, every Jewish son who is born you are to cast into the Nile, and every daughter you to keep alive. So he was allowing the daughters to live, and he was having the sons murdered, having them killed, having them drowned in the Nile River. And you notice here that there are really two threats in that edict from the king. One is explicit, like it's explicitly stated, that Jewish baby boys are to be killed. And the other threat is implied, it's implicit, that if you disobey this command and keep a Jewish baby boy alive, you will be disobedient to the king's law and therefore risk your own life. So, in other words, Moses' parents had two choices. They could either kill their sons and save themselves, or they could try to save their sons and risk their own lives. And there was really no middle path for Moses' parents. And that's important to see because Hebrews chapter 11, verse 23, doesn't make sense if you don't see that. Because it says, by faith, when Moses was born, he was hidden for 3 months by his parents. And it says, because they saw he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. And so you might read that and respond to that and say, well, why does it say they weren't afraid? I mean, of course they were afraid of the king's edict. Otherwise, they would not have been hiding their baby boy. They would have been showing him off to the neighbors if they weren't afraid of the king's command that the baby boys would be killed. So what does that mean, that they weren't afraid and they hid their baby? Well, you would expect it to say they hid their son because they were afraid of the king's edict, not because they weren't afraid. Of course, they were afraid of the king's edict. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been hiding him, right? It wouldn't have been even an issue. They would have been showing him off. They would have carried him around in public. It would have been just normal, celebrating the birth of their son. So what does it mean? What does this mean? Well, the answer is that there are two threats in this king's edict, not just one. One threat was against the babies, and one was against those who don't kill their baby sons. If you kill the baby, you save your life. If you don't kill the baby, you risk your life. So when Moses' parents decided that they were not going to drown Moses in the Nile River, but instead they were going to hide him, they're actually risking their own safety. In other words, they look the fear of death and perhaps torture in the face and say, we're not giving in to you. We won't kill our son out of fear for our own lives, fear of death, fear of punishment, fear of the consequence of breaking the king's edict will not control us. And the point of the text is this: that act of courage against the king and that act of love towards their son comes from what? Faith. Faith, the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things unseen. By faith, Moses was hidden by his parents because they did not fear for their own lives for going against the king's edict. Well, how does faith produce that kind of courage? That kind of boldness? Well, I think the definition from chapter 11, verse 1 gives us the answer. It's the assurance of things hoped for. Faith frees us for this kind of radical courage and risk-taking because it is the assurance that what God promises to those who die in the path of faith is better than what the world promises those who shun risk and save themselves. We're going to see that as we keep walking through this text. More simply put, faith in God's promises frees us from the fear of death and makes us brave in the life of faith. Now, there's a kind of a minor point here that I want to bring out to us tonight, as well as this main one that I've already mentioned. You know, it's important for all of us who want our lives to be on the cutting edge where there are risks and dangers and great crises and great needs. And it's this point of realism and balance. You notice Moses' parents risked their lives by not killing their baby. But they did hide their son, right? They did hide him. And so some people's minds, I think, especially, maybe like I could even see myself in my younger years and more in my immaturity in the faith, with when I didn't have a whole lot of real life experience and was kind of out of touch of what it means to live out faith in the complexity of a fallen world. Someone might say, well, no, if Moses' parents really would have had faith, they would have just entrusted the child's care to God and they just would have walked around and held that baby and shown him off to everybody, right? Like I don't know about you guys, but there's something about us, I think, in our zealousness sometimes, in our immaturity, in our walk with God, that's the pinnacle of real faith. It's like, throw logic out the window and how life works in the real world, and let's just, we just trust in God, right? Just trust in God. And what I want to point out here is that's not necessarily real faith. And this isn't a lack of faith because they hid their child. I immediately think about Corrie ten Boom. Some of you have read her testimony, her biography, and she survived Nazi Germany, and she hid Jews and Christians from the Nazis. And I think about, I remember as a young man reading her story and having these conversations of, well, did she really, she hid them underneath her floor, in underneath the house and in cutouts in the floor. And was that really faith? If she really would have had faith, then she would have just trusted that God would have protected them. And that's faith doesn't call us to check our mind at the door, right? It doesn't call us to check logic to the door. So how would I respond to somebody who would come to something like this, or maybe not even this text, but in real life, and they might say, well, you shouldn't have hid them at all or do any of this. They don't really trust God. They're using human ingenuity to protect their baby instead of entrusting him to God. And I think perhaps the best way to respond is simply to say, read your Bible and read it carefully. Because it says so very clearly here in chapter 11, verse 23, that Moses' parents did indeed have faith and they hid their baby. Not killing the baby put their life at risk and was a great act of faith. And yes, hiding their baby was an act of human but God-given wisdom and no less from faith. And to do otherwise would have probably been presumption. Kind of like the idea of Jesus jumping off the roof of the temple to see if God would catch him. Well, certainly Jesus knew that God had the power to catch him, but that would have been an act of presumption on his part. And so he didn't jump to test God. So how do we apply this today in our lives? Well, one way would be to say that following God's call to work with sick patients in third world countries is an act of risk-taking faith, right? We've probably, those of us who have traveled internationally to places that are less safe and have risk of disease and working in environments where it's somewhat dangerous, we've had people say, why would you do that? Why would you go and risk catching chikungunya from mosquitoes in Guyana? Why would you do that? Why would you go and help give vaccines to people who have no access to why would you do that? Why would you go to a place where there's persecution and you could possibly be kidnapped and tortured for your faith? Why in the world would you take that kind of risk? And it's because we have faith in what God has called us to take the gospel to the ends of the earth. And while there might be dangers in those places, we have assurance of what God has said, that this is what he's called us to, and this is what he has put before us as followers of Jesus. But on the flip side, when we go and do those things, it doesn't mean we throw all logic out the window, right? I can show you my yellow card of a number of vaccines that I've taken as I've traveled to third world countries. Because God doesn't ask us to check our mind at the door when we walk forward in faith. If I was working with sick patients, I would wear gloves and I would wear a mask in those places. Not because I don't think God can keep me from getting it without those things, but God doesn't call us to check our mind at the door. Those treatments and acting in a wise way is still an act of faith. And so that's exactly what his parents were doing. They were, yes, risking their lives, but they also used wisdom, following God's call to live and move into maybe an inner city because he's asked you to minister in that place or plant a church in those places. That's a risk-taking faith, but buying deadbolts to put on your door is an act of faithful wisdom, right? Following God's call to Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan with your children, moving across the world is a risk-taking faith, but giving them malaria treatments is probably an act of faithful wisdom. We don't throw wisdom and logic out the door when we walk forward in faith. So, in other words, living by faith is often perplexing. It's often perplexing. I think this is why Paul in Colossians prayed constantly that his converts, those who were converted to the faith, would have spiritual wisdom and bear fruit in every good work. Risky, inconvenient, dangerous, inopportune good works we should do will seldom be written in the sky or spoken in a dream. That's why Paul prays for what? Spiritual wisdom. Spiritual wisdom. These kinds of decisions will be wrestled with in agonizing prayer and saturating ourselves in the Word of God. And above all, faith, the assurance of things hoped for, will produce radical confidence in us, in God's promise to take care of us. That's the main key to unlock the power and path of risk-taking faith. So that's crisis number one. It's actually not Moses, it's his parents choosing not to give in to the king's edict, choosing to risk their own lives in order to save Moses's and trust in what God has said. Now, I'm going to skip to crisis number 3 in Moses's life. I'm going to jump over verses 24 and 25 and 26 to this third one in verse 27. And I'm going to make this move because what we see here in verse 27 happens 40 years later. So I told you this whole thing happens over the course of 80 years. Verse 27 is 40 years after Moses' birth and his parents' faith is demonstrated. And it's a situation where Moses faces something very similar to what his parents faced. And I think we'll understand both of these better if we connect them. So that's why I'm skipping over, and we'll come back to verse 24 through 26. According to Exodus chapter 2, we keep reading the story of Moses. And Moses, actually, as he grows up, we know his story, right? He's taken in by one of Pharaoh's daughters. And as he grows up, he begins to identify himself not with the people of Egypt who have adopted him, so to speak, and taken him in, but instead he begins to identify himself with his birth people, his Jewish heritage. And he begins to be angered by his people's slavery. And he found an Egyptian beating a Jew, And Moses intervened in that situation, and he actually killed the Egyptian. And he thought that this had happened in secret, that no one knew, that no one saw it. But the next day, he discovers that word has gotten around that he's the one who killed this Egyptian. So in Exodus chapter 2, verse 14, it says, "Then Moses was afraid and said, 'Surely the matter has become known.' Then the next verse says, 'When Pharaoh heard of this matter, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from the presence of Pharaoh and settled in the land of Midian.'" Now, here's the problem, like the one we saw in verse 23. Is Moses leaving Egypt because he's afraid, or is it because he's not afraid? Well, it's the same question, right? Were his parents afraid when they hid their baby, or were they not afraid? In verse 23, it says they hid him because they weren't afraid of the king's edict. Well, here in verse 27 of chapter 11, look at it again. It says, "By faith he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king." So it tells us here in chapter 11 that he left not fearing the wrath of the king. But in Exodus chapter 2, verse 14, it says that Moses was afraid whenever he heard that his violence was known among the Egyptians. So you see kind of the similarity between these two crises, right? The question comes up, well, which is it, right? Did Moses leave Egypt out of fear, or didn't he? It's like asking, did Moses' parents hide Moses from Pharaoh out of fear, or didn't they? And the answer for his parents is that they did fear for the child's life, but they did not act out of fear for themselves. They risked their lives, and they did it by faith in future hope. Well, it's a little bit different here with Moses, but not basically different. He probably did save his own life by leaving Egypt, right? The king is seeking to kill him. It tells us that in Exodus. But was that his motivation in leaving? Was fearful self-preservation his motive in leaving Egypt? Well, when verse 27 says, "By faith he left Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king," did the author of Hebrews just forget about Exodus 2:14 and the fear that it says he felt? Or is he pointing us to something very crucial and very deep in Moses' heart so that we won't misunderstand Exodus chapter 2, verse 14? And I think the key is found in verse 27 in the word endured. Look at verse 27 again. "By faith he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible." Some of your translations might say persevered instead of endured there in verse 27. And I think what the author of Hebrews is trying to point out to us is this. It wasn't fear that ultimately motivated Moses to leave Egypt. It was endurance. It was because he endured, having faith in one who is invisible. So what does that mean, endurance or perseverance? Well, what did he endure in? What did he persevere in? Well, endurance implies a chosen path of difficulty that you are tempted to forsake, but you hang in there and endure. So it's a chosen path, right? A chosen path through difficulty, through trial, through pain, through suffering. What the writer is referring to when he says in verse 27 that he left Egypt for he endured, well, what path had Moses chosen that required endurance to stay on and even lead him out of Egypt for 40 years before God calls him to come back to rescue his people? Well, I think the answer to that is this second crisis in verses 24 through 26. Let's go back and pick that up now. These verses, they describe to us a radically dangerous path, a costly path that Moses had chosen, and mark this, before he ever felt threatened by the Pharaoh. Well, what was this path? Well, let's read it again together. Verse 24. It says, by faith, Moses, when he was grown up, look at this, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. So by faith, Moses, when he had grown up, consciously, willfully refused to embrace the title and the identity of a prince of Egypt, of one of Pharaoh's daughter's sons. And he even uses the word here, right? He, in verse 25, choosing rather, this is the chosen path, right? So long before he ever killed the Egyptian and received the threat of being killed by Pharaoh, he chose to endure ill treatment with God's people. He said, I'm one of God's people. I'm not going to continue to walk as a prince of Egypt, as a son of the daughter of Pharaoh, but instead I'm going to endure the ill treatment with the people of God rather than continuing to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. Let me stop there for a second because, this I think is a great reminder for us. What does he call sin? The passing pleasures of sin. It's a reminder for us that, sin, we sometimes in the church, we like to kind of maybe pretend that it's just always so terrible. And this is a reminder that the Bible doesn't lie to us about sin. I remember as a young man, I've told you guys this before, one of my biggest challenges in walking with Jesus was I would look at my friends who didn't walk with Jesus and did all the things that the world says to do. And I remember I would have these thoughts, man, they look like they're having a whole lot more fun than I'm having. I remember having, that was one of my biggest challenges as a teenager and college student and trying to walk the path of Jesus, thinking, man, they just seem like they have a whole lot more fun than I do. Because I have to say no to all these things, and I have to, instead of sleeping in, I got to get up and go to church, and I got to, and all of those things. And I remember battling with that, and I remember thinking in my mind, if sin is so bad, why does it look like they're having so much fun? And the truth is, the Bible is very honest with us. What does it call it? Pleasure. The pleasures of sin. Sin is not always not pleasurable. In fact, the Bible says it actually is, but it says it's the passing pleasures of sin. The passing pleasures of sin. Sin is often fun. Sin is often enjoyable. If sin were as terrible as taking a spoonful of nasty grape-flavored cough medicine, then none of us would do it, right? We wouldn't do it. We wouldn't sin. The reason sin is addictive and enticing is because it does feel good. There is a pleasure in it. And the Bible doesn't try to hide that reality from us. This passage, just in that simple phrase, reminds us, yes, sin can be pleasurable, it can be fun, but at its best, it is a passing pleasure. And that's why, we all know this from experience, sin requires an even greater level of sin to provide the same pleasure, right? You have to continue to up the dosage to get the same impact. This is why so often sin turns into an addiction. So he says that Moses considering, this means he considered, he counted the cost. There was careful consideration. He thought through this carefully. He considered the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt. It says, for he was looking to the reward. If you remember, when we started this series, I kind of gave an overarching tagline. You may remember what it is? To the whole book of Hebrews. Jesus is better. Jesus is better. Moses is an example, a beautiful example to us of someone who has said the reward is greater. Following Jesus is better. Sure, sin and identifying with Egypt, identifying with the world, living in this kind of lifestyle, sure, there may be some passing pleasure there. But the reward I get with following Jesus and identifying with Jesus and being a part of God's people, it's better, it's best. His path, his ways, it is better. And it's not just someone who says that with their mind and even just believes that in their heart. It's someone whose feet begin to follow that belief. His action begins to flesh out that he truly believes that. And so he says no. He makes the choice long before there's ever a threat from Pharaoh to say, I'm going to identify with God's people. I'm going to identify with him because I believe that he is better. And so the writer expresses this dangerous, painful path that Moses has chosen in two ways. First, in verse 25, it's the choosing of ill treatment with the people of God over the passing pleasures of sin. And then second, in verse 26, it is choosing the reproach of Christ, the Messiah, over the treasures of Egypt. And don't miss this. That choice was made by Moses before the threat of Pharaoh ever came. The bridges had already been burned between Moses and Egypt. It had happened in his heart. It hadn't happened yet geographically, but spiritually and morally, he's already gone. He's already said no to Egypt and the pleasures of this world. Do you see that? That's what he's saying in verses 24, 25, and 26. So long before it happens geographically, it's happened in his heart. Now, the question was, would he endure that chosen path? Would he endure that chosen path of suffering for the people of God and the glory of Christ? Or would he cave in like so many cave in today to the Egypt, the passing pleasures of this world? So was Moses' flight from Egypt a departure to a self-serving, fearful pursuit of ease and comfort and safety? Well, verse 27 answers that question, no. By faith, he left Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king. Fear was not his basic mindset. What was? Well, the next phrase answers it. For he endured. In what? In the same deep motive that caused him to choose ill treatment with the people of God and reproach for the sake of the Messiah. Namely, he endured as seeing him who is unseen. In other words, by faith, by looking to God's promise, not Pharaoh's threat. This is the same motive that drove his radical choices in verses 24, 25, and 26. And you can see it at the end of verse 26. He chose ill treatment with God's people. He chose reproach for Christ because he was looking to the reward. Looking to the reward in verse 26 corresponds to seeing him who is unseen in verse 27. He had by faith burned the bridges in his mind by the assurance of things hoped for, and then by faith he burned them in his flight by the conviction of things unseen. You see it? Yes, he experienced fear when the word spread that he had killed an Egyptian while saving a Jew, just as his parents had experienced fear when they saved their baby boy and risked their own lives. But hiding their baby was not an act of fearful, self-serving unbelief. And Moses' leaving Egypt was not an act of fearful, self-serving unbelief either. It was a persevering, an enduring, in spite of fear, in the obedience of faith. He wasn't driven merely or mainly by fear. He looked to the unseen God to work out some purpose for his people. And 40 years later, we find out in verse 29 that he led the people of God across the Red Sea as on dry land, and the Egyptians, when they attempted to do the same, were drowned in that Red Sea. Isn't it interesting that Moses, who the Egyptians wanted drowned in the Nile River, was spared for a greater purpose to rescue God's people and bring glory to his name. And now, verse 29, those same Egyptians are drowned in the Red Sea. Just irony? I don't think so. I don't think so. God was at work. Moses and his family stepped out in faith. And he burned those bridges between himself and Egypt. They were burned in his heart, and they were burned by faith. And that's what faith does all throughout this chapter. Faith is a hunger for God that triumphs over our hunger for the pleasures of this world, for the treasures of this world. And so what faith does in us, what it produces, is a radical, God-centered, risk-taking, people-loving behavior. Faith is believing that Jesus is better. It's a belief that then produces action in our lives. And so my challenge for us tonight is, let's be like Moses. Let's look to the reward of God's promises, as it says in verse 26. Let's look to the God who is unseen, as it says in verse 27. And let's be so hungry for the superior worth of our God that the bridges are burned to 100 sins and 100 fears. Let's walk forward, putting feet to our faith. You know, I'm convinced, Pastor Jeremy preached, I think it was 2 weeks ago, and I think the title of the message was Reverse the Curse, and he was preaching in 1 Peter, and he made the statement that God's ways are always best, something to that extent. God's ways are always best. And I believe that with all my heart. I hope that you believe that as well. But I'm convinced that we will never consistently choose his ways until we truly believe that they're best. And I see this all the time in people's lives where they'll say one thing, well, yeah, I believe that's what the Bible says, or I believe that's what the Bible teaches, but you just don't understand, Nathan. You know, you don't understand my life. You don't understand my circumstances. You don't understand what's happening here in my job or in my relationship, whatever it is. And so their actions, while they say with their mouths they believe that, their actions say something different. And so what that tells me is they don't really believe his ways are best, that his design is best. And I just hope that as we study through this, especially this chapter, but really this entire book, my hope and my prayer for myself, for you, is that when we meet those moments, those crises in our lives, and I know like some of us may be in here tonight and there's some crisis that you're facing in your life. My challenge to you is to, if you're not believing it, to ask God to help you believe that his way is best. And to help you to put feet to that. To not just give lip service to it, but to put feet to that. To say, you know what? It may not make total sense right now to me, but I do believe, God, that your way is best. I believe that you're better. I'm going to fix my eyes not on what I see here, but on the reward, on the unseen, on the eternal. And I'm going to trust that if I will just take that step forward in radical courage to do what you've called me to do, I'm going to believe that it's going to be best for me and my family and my church and my community. I'm going to believe it. And I'm going to act on that belief, because that's what real faith is. And Moses gives us such an incredible example of that. May we be so hungry for the superior worth of our glorious God that we burn those bridges to 100 sins and 100 fears.